What would you do if your corporate network or website came under attack? What would the impact be on your customers and your employees? I'm John Graham Cumming, Cloudflare's CTO, and I'm here to talk about ransom DDoS attacks and how to protect your business. In recent months, we've seen an alarming rise in targeted cybersecurity threats known as ransom DDoS attacks. In this video, I will explain what these attacks entail and how you can protect your business. The goal of ransom DDoS attacks is extorting large sums of money from their victims. In a typical scenario, a malicious actor sends a ransom note threatening to unleash a digital swarm of bogus traffic designed to completely take down your website and potentially your internal corporate network. They may launch an attack before contacting you, as a way to demonstrate their potential to inflict harm. Should you find yourself in this situation, follow these steps. First, do not panic, as this may play into the attacker's hands. Second, contact law enforcement and provide them with a copy of the ransom letter. Third, do not pay the ransom. Even if you meet the attacker's demands, there is no guarantee that they will not attack again. Prepare before you're attacked by visiting cloudflare.com/ransom-DDoS to learn how our DDoS protection can thwart attacks against your internet properties and how Cloudflare Magic Transit extends the same world-class protection to your entire network. Thanks for listening, and do reach out to us to protect yourself and your properties against these attacks.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Vivek, and I lead product marketing for our application performance portfolio here at Cloudflare. The pre-recorded video you just saw was our CTO, John Graham Cumming, talking about the threat of ransom DDoS attacks, which has become very commonplace lately. I'll talk about that in more detail in subsequent slides, but I wanted to first kick off with welcoming you and a few housekeeping items, and then dive right into the DDoS trends we observed over Cloudflare's network. So quickly, a few housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box on the Q&A chat to your right. We will get to them at the end of the presentation. Also, a quick reminder that a recorded version of this webinar will be available after the session on our website. And we'll also send it to you via email so you can rewatch it or share it with your colleagues, whatever. All right, so let's get started. I want to begin with this slide, which is a visual representation of who we are and really why we exist as well. Cloudflare was built and founded in 2010 with one mission: to help build a better internet. And by a better internet, we mean one that's faster, that's more secure, and one that's more reliable for everyone. And to do that, we've built a large global network. And over the years, we've expanded our physical footprint in over 250 cities across 100+ countries. Today, we own and operate one of the largest networks in the world, interconnecting with over 10,000 networks with a capacity of 100 terabits per second and growing. And as of the third quarter of 2021, we mitigated over 76 billion, that's billion with a B, threats on average each day. If there's one thing you should take away from the slide, it is that Cloudflare operates at a massive scale, and our network is architected to deliver measurable significance to our customers around the world. And one benefit of operating a large global network like ours is that a large amount of traffic on the internet touches our network, giving us good insights into the internet traffic at large. In this presentation today, we'll go over some of the trends we saw in 2021, particularly the latest trends in the last quarter of 2021 related to DDoS attacks observed over Cloudflare's network. So without further ado, let's get started. One of the big trends we saw, one of the largest trends, I'd say, arguably, we saw last year was around ransom DDoS attack. You just saw the video recorded by our CTO, John Graham Cumming, about it. And even though the attackers didn't spare most industries in their attacks, companies in the voice over IP industry, the VoIP industry, were arguably most severely hit. But before we get into attacks over VoIP companies or even talking about what voice over IP is first, let's first take a look at what ransom DDoS attacks are. So we've seen this in the last year. We've seen ransomware, we've seen ransom DDoS, both of these in the headlines. We've also seen journalists often conflate the two. But they're actually two different problems. Ransomware is a malicious software that encrypts an organization's systems and databases, rendering them inaccessible and unusable. Now, that's essentially malware, which is usually introduced into an organization's systems via phishing emails, tricking employees into clicking on a link or downloading a file. And of course, once the malware is installed on the employee's device, it encrypts the device and can propagate into the entire network of the organization's servers and their devices. And then, of course, the attacker demands money, usually in the form of Bitcoin, in exchange for decrypting the organization's systems and granting them access back to their systems. Now, this can be very disruptive, but what's even more dangerous, arguably, is a ransom DDoS attack. Unlike a ransomware attack, a ransom DDoS attack does not encrypt a company's system, but it aims to knock them offline if a ransom is not paid. And what makes it even more dangerous is that they don't require the attacker that it doesn't require the attacker to gain access to a business's internal systems to execute the attack. All they need is an exposed vulnerable IP address of a server that's exposed to the internet. However, with a strong DDoS protection strategy in place, a ransom DDoS attack has little to no effect on businesses. And both of these threats are impacting industries across the globe: the financial industry, transportation, oil and gas, consumer goods. We saw headlines even about education and healthcare last year. And who are these people who are conducting these attacks? They're entities claiming to be Fancy Lazarus, Fancy Bear, Lazarus Group, and more recently, the Russian hacker group called Rebel, who are once again launching these ransomware and ransom DDoS attacks against companies' websites as well as network infrastructure. They often also send a ransom note prior to launching the DDoS attack, and sometimes even a demonstration attack, which is typically over UDP and lasts about 30 minutes to 120 minutes. And we've also seen that the ransom note is typically sent out to group email aliases of the company. So these are some group email aliases that they can find from the company's website, like knock at, or support at, or help at, or legal at. And sometimes it also goes to the CEO or the CTO's email inbox. So what should you do if you receive a ransom note such as this? Well, first, what we recommend is don't panic, and we recommend you do not pay the ransom, because paying the ransom only encourages and funds bad actors. There's also no guarantee that you won't be attacked again anyway. And also do contact your local law enforcement. Be ready to provide a copy of the ransom letter you received and any other logs or packet captures. And also, finally, activate an effective DDoS protection strategy. We tell this to our customers all the time. Cloud-based DDoS protection can be quickly onboarded in the event of an active threat. And with a team of security experts like the ones we have at Cloudflare on your side, risks can be immediately mitigated and effectively managed. All right, so that's what ransom DDoS attacks are. Now let's talk about ransom DDoS attacks specifically on VoIP companies. But before we talk into that, very quickly, what is voice over IP? It's essentially a term that's used to describe a group of technologies that allows for communication of multimedia over the internet. It's essentially how FaceTime works. It's how Zoom calls works. It's how I'm doing this webinar over the internet. And a key protocol behind most voice over IP calls is the heavily adopted session initiation protocol, SIP. It was designed as a flexible and modular protocol for initiating calls or sessions, whether it's voice or video over the internet. RTP is another protocol that runs over the UDP, and it carries the media stream itself. So these are two main protocols that VoIP uses. And one of the fundamental requirements for voice over IP, for it to be effective in real time, is for it to feel natural, immediate, and responsive, is that it needs to be fast. Speed is one of the key fundamental features for natural sounding audio and high definition video without lag or stutter, so user experience is good. Now, what's happening is that while SIP and voice over IP protocols can be implemented over TCP or UDP, the underlying protocol is typically UDP, and it's being exploited for DDoS attacks. And without proper protection in place, the race for a good or a superb call experience comes at the cost of security, which attackers have learned to take advantage of. So what they're doing is they're overwhelming unprotected voice over IP servers with floods of specially crafted UDP packets. And one way attackers overwhelm VoIP servers is by pretending to initiate calls. Each time a malicious call initiation request is sent to the victim, their server uses computational power and memory to authenticate that request. And if the attacker can generate enough call initiations, they can overwhelm that victim's server and prevent it from processing legitimate calls. And this is a classic DDoS technique applied to SIP. So what we saw in the last year was significant and large voice over IP providers being targeted by volumetric DDoS attacks. And these were multi-vector attacks that combined both L7 attacks targeting critical HTTP websites and API endpoints, as well as L3 and L4 attacks targeting voice over IP server infrastructure. In some cases, these attacks resulted in significant impact to the target's VoIP services and website availability. You might have read some in the news as well. And the kind of attacks we saw were TCP floods targeting stateful firewalls, UDP floods targeting SIP infrastructure. So this is floods of UDP traffic that have no well-known fingerprint, and they're aimed at critical voice over IP services. And because they don't have well-known fingerprints, they're also very, very hard to detect without sophisticated DDoS mitigation solution in place. We also saw UDP reflection attacks targeting SIP infrastructure. So these methods, when targeted at SIP or RTP services, can very easily overwhelm SBCs, so their session border controllers or other telephony infrastructure, which are put in place to have some fundamental security, but even that's not been enough. And then we're also seeing some very SIP protocol-specific attacks at the application layer itself. And again, the numbers you see here, the graphs you see here are massive. These attacks peaked at over 130 gigabits per second at 17.4 million packets per second. These numbers are huge. Of course, needless to say, if you were a Cloudflare customer, you were protected automatically, and these attacks were detected and mitigated without any latency or performance degradation at all. Another major trend, another major headline-making news last year was around the Meris botnet. You might have seen some major headlines around a large botnet that was used to launch record-breaking attacks. So what is Meris, and how did it manage to launch some of the largest attacks ever seen? Well, Meris is Latvian for plague. It's the name of an active botnet behind a series of recent DDoS attacks that targeted thousands of websites around the world. It was originally detected in late June of 2021 and is believed to have compromised about 30,000 to 250,000 bots. It was formed of infected routers and networking hardware manufactured by the Latvian company called Microtech. And according to Microtech's blog, the attackers exploited a vulnerability in the router's OS, which enabled attackers to gain unauthenticated remote access to read and write arbitrary files. And of course, the administration of router OS can be done either via direct SSH connection or by using a configuration utility called Winbox, and the vulnerability itself was possible because of a directory traversal vulnerability in the Winbox interface with the router OS. Now, this vulnerability was patched after its detection back in 2018, but it is still being exploited in compromised devices that do not use the patched router OS versions. So, of course, Microtech has advised its customers to upgrade their device's OS version to only allow access to the devices via secure IPsec connections and to really inspect for any abnormalities in scripts. But as we know, not everybody is doing that. And that's what's causing this large botnet, and attackers are exploiting it to launch these large DDoS attacks. Now, Cloudflare's DDoS protection systems automatically detected and mitigated Meris attacks. And we are continuously working to get even more granular data, because since the appearance of Meris in the last year, Cloudflare systems have, during our analyses of the Meris botnet attacks, our security experts noticed that the attack vectors adapted to try and bypass Cloudflare's defenses. Now, needless to say, they were not successful, but we wanted to stay many steps ahead of the attackers. And so our engineers deployed additional stronger mitigation rules that blocked and mitigated Meris attacks even more comprehensively. And one side effect of these mitigation rules is that it also provides us with granular threat intelligence on the Meris attacks. And since we deployed these additional rules in early August, we've seen Meris launch an average of 104 DDoS attacks on Cloudflare's customers every day. And the highest figure we've seen was on September 6th, when Meris was used to launch 261 unique attacks against some of Cloudflare's customers. Now, none of these customers ever noticed that they were being attacked. They had no downtime. They had no impact to any latency or performance. They were going through business just as usual. And this was despite some attacks accounting for a good percentage of the total application layer attacks that Cloudflare observes on a normal day. So again, these are graphs that show the amount and the scale at which these attacks were launched. Overall, on average, Meris targets about 50 different websites and applications every single day. And although the average attack peaked at about 106,000 requests per second, the median attack size was actually much smaller, around 17,000 requests per second. The largest attack we've seen, which is also one of the largest attacks we've seen ever on Cloudflare's network, was 17.2 million requests per second, and that occurred in July. In this graph on the right, you see the daily highest requests per second rate after we deployed the new rules. And since then, the largest attack we've seen was about 16.7 million requests per second, which is also, once again, one of the highest requests per second, one of the biggest, largest attacks we've seen over our network in history. And this took place on August 19th. So when we zoom out a little bit and look at our network and look at how Meris actually distributed all of their attack traffic, we analyzed the data and that we observed over our network to better understand what industries were being most attacked by the Meris botnet. And when we looked at it, we saw that the banking, financial services, and insurance industry, the BFSI industry, was the most targeted. And after BFSI, there was publishing and gaming and gambling and IT services industries. And to distinguish between the two graphs on the left and the right, what you're looking at here, on the left is a distribution of the attacks by the total number of requests per industry. So BFSI saw the most number of malicious traffic directed towards them. On the right is a distribution of industries by the number of domains or internet properties that were attacked. And in terms of the percentage of targeted websites, the computer software industry came in the first place. Almost 4% of all impacted websites were on the computer software companies protected by Cloudflare, followed by gaming or gambling and IT services. And this is really not surprising because we see these industries targeted the most every quarter by DDoS attacks, both on the application layer as well as the network layer as well. Now, when we look at how the country's distribution was, similarly to the analysis of the top industries, we can calculate the Meris DDoS activity rate per target country to identify where the attacks came from or which countries were the most attacked. In total, China-based companies saw the largest amount of DDoS attacks. More than 33% of all requests generated by Meris were destined for China-based companies that are protected by Cloudflare. Australia came in the second place and the US in the third. On the other hand, when we look at the number of websites that were targeted by Meris, the US came in the first place. More than 12% of all websites that were targeted by Meris are operated by US-based companies, and China came in the second place with 5.6%, and Russia in the third with about 4.4%. And this is a very interesting GIF that our engineers created. Now, although only tens of thousands of bots have been detected per attack, it is estimated that there are roughly, as I mentioned before, 250,000 bots worldwide. As indicated in this GIF, the botnet is formed of MikroTik routers And using the source IP addresses of the routers, we're able to identify the origin country of the bots to paint a geographical representation of the bots' presence and growth over time. So essentially, this is the evolution of the Meris botnet over time and space. The change in the location of the bots doesn't necessarily indicate that the botnet is growing or shrinking. It could also be that different bot groups are activated from time to time to spread the load of the attacks while attempting not to get caught. At the beginning of August, what you see on this graph here is that the majority of the bots were located in Brazil. But by the end of August, that number plummeted. And meanwhile, the number of infected devices grew in the United States. From the beginning of September, the number of bots were significantly higher in the US, Russia, India, Indonesia, and China. All right, so we talked about ransom DDoS attacks. We talked over ransom DDoS attacks over voice over IP companies. We also talked about Meris. We talked about how they're launching some of the largest DDoS attacks on the application layer that we ever saw. Now let's actually zoom in to specific trends that we saw in the last quarter of 2021. And let's begin with application layer DDoS attacks. Now, application layer DDoS attacks are specifically HTTP DDoS attacks that usually aim to disrupt a web server by making it unable to process legitimate user requests. So if a web server is bombarded with more requests than it can process, that server will automatically drop legitimate requests, and in some cases even crash, resulting in degraded performance or an outage for legitimate users. So when we zoom out and look at some of the trends we observed in 2021, these are the graphs. Now, anytime any of our customers are attacked by a DDoS attack, each DDoS customer is prompted with an automated survey by Cloudflare to help us better understand the nature of the attack and the success of the mitigation itself. For over 2 years now, we've been running this survey, and one question on the survey is if they received a ransom note demanding payment in exchange to stop the DDoS attack. And for the first time, we observed that a large number of them, specifically about 22% of surveyed customers who responded, said that yes, they did receive a ransom note. And this is a very disturbing trend we noticed, and we expect this to continue into 2022 as well. In fact, a recent report I was reading talked about how the ransom payments just in the last year exceeded all ransom payments in the previous decade. And we don't expect that to change going into 2022 either. Now, when we look at the most DDoSed industries for application layer attacks, we see that the manufacturing industry was the most attacked in Q4 of 2021. And this was, when we look at the numbers quarter over quarter, there was a whopping increase of 640%. Now, this seems like a large increase, but typically the industries that are impacted are industries like gaming and gambling, the IT industry, the computer software industry, and these are also listed over here, but the largest increase was in the manufacturing industry itself. Of course, the business services and gaming and gambling industries were the second and the most third targeted industries as well. And this doesn't necessarily indicate that all attackers were only focusing on these industries. What it means is that some of the largest attacks we saw, some of the largest number of attacks we saw in the last quarter of 2021 were directed towards these industries. Now, when we look at where the attacks originated, to understand the source of HTTP attacks, we look at the geolocation of the source IP address belonging to the client that generated the attack HTTP requests. And unlike network layer attacks, where the source IP addresses cannot be spoofed, where source IP addresses can be spoofed for network layer attacks, for HTTP attacks, you can't really do that. And a high percentage of DDoS activity in a given country usually indicates the presence of botnets operating from within the country's borders. And when we look at the numbers for Q4 of 2021, the US was in the second place, followed by Brazil and China, Brazil and India, but China was in the first place. Now, when we look at the target of the DDoS attacks, we, in order to identify which countries were targeted, we bucket the DDoS attacks by our customers' billing countries and represented as a percentage out of the total number of, a percentage of out of all DDoS attacks. So it's not it's a percentage of the total DDoS traffic that they've seen at some of the data centers that Cloudflare has in those areas compared to the total traffic that is received. And the most companies in the US were the most targeted, followed by Canada and then Germany. Now let's look at network layer DDoS attacks. While application layer attacks target the application, the L7 of the OSI model, running the service that end users are trying to access, network layer attempts to overwhelm networking infrastructure. So these are inline routers and servers and the internet link itself. And when we looked at the data for all of last year and the spread of all the network layer DDoS attacks that we saw month by month, you'll see that this chunk towards the end, this pink chunk for December, is the most. So Q4, first of all, was the busiest quarter in 2021 for attackers. Over 43% of all network layer DDoS attacks took place in the fourth quarter of 2021 itself. Now, October itself within Q4 was a relatively calmer month, but in November, which is also the month for Chinese Singles Day, the American Thanksgiving holiday, Black Friday, and Cyber Monday, the number of network layer DDoS attacks nearly doubled. And the number of observed attacks kept increasing towards the final days of December 2021 as the world was preparing to close out the year. In fact, the total number of attacks in December alone was higher than all the attacks we saw in the second quarter of 2021 and almost equivalent to all the attacks we saw in the first quarter of 2021. Now, there's two ways that you can measure the size of a network layer DDoS attack. One is the volume of the traffic it delivers, which is typically measured as the bit rate, so specifically in gigabits per second. And another is the packets it delivers, and that's measured in packet rate, so specifically in packets per second. Attacks with high bit rates attempt to saturate the internet link, while those with high packet rates attempt to overwhelm the routers or the servers or other inline hardware appliances, which have to spend a lot of computational power in basically servicing these packets. And the distribution of attacks by their size and month is what is shown on this slide, and what's shown is in bit rate. So you'll notice that most of the attacks were under 500 megabits per second. And when we look at the distribution, even in packets per second, we notice that most of the attacks were under 50,000 packets per second, which might seem small compared to other headline-making large attacks that I was just talking about, but they are often sufficient to create major disruption for internet properties that are not protected by, say, an always-on automated cloud-based DDoS protection service. We're seeing that a lot of organizations have uplinks provided by their service providers with a bandwidth capacity that's often smaller than a gigabits per second. And assuming that their public-facing network interface also, of course, serves legitimate traffic, DDoS attacks even smaller than 500 megabits per second are often capable of taking down exposed internet properties. So what we're seeing is more and more a lot of attacks are shorter in duration and smaller in size. One exception to that last quarter was in November, when our systems automatically detected and mitigated an almost 2 terabits per second DDoS attack. So this is not one of the smaller or shorter attacks, but it was a multi-vector attack that combined DNS amplification attacks and UDP floods. And it was launched from approximately 15,000 bots running a variant of the original Meris botnet, Meris code on IoT devices, and unpatched GitLab instances. Keep in mind, this is not the Meris botnet. This is the Meris botnet that we saw a few years ago, and a variant of that is still creating a lot of havoc. Now, when we look at DDoS attacks by duration, as I mentioned just now. We were seeing shorter attacks take more center stage. And when I talk about duration, we measure the duration of an attack by recording the difference between when it is first detected by our systems as an attack and the last packet we see with that attack signature towards that specific target. In the last quarter of 2021, about 98% of all network layer DDoS attacks lasted less than an hour. And this trend is consistent with what we've seen in the last few years, in fact. This is very common for most attacks to be short-lived. Even more so, a trend we're seeing again and again is that as the number of attacks increases, their rate and duration seems to decrease. Now, you might think that these short bursty attacks, why should I be so worried about them? Well, they do still cause damage, often trying to cause disruption or at least slow down of networks without being detected by DDoS protection systems. And there's a lot of DDoS services that rely on manual analyses and mitigation, and this might prove to be useless against these types of attacks because they're often over before the analyst even identifies the attack traffic. Another reason we think that these short attacks are being launched is essentially to probe the cyber defenses of the target, and they might be used as smoke screens for something else that might be going on in your network. All right, so attack vectors. An attack vector is a term used to describe the method the attacker utilizes in their attempt to cause that denial of service event. And as observed in previous quarters and even in the last couple of years, one thing that's been consistent is that attacks utilizing SYN floods and UDP-based protocols remain the most popular method by attackers. So what's a SYN flood attack? It's essentially a DDoS attack that exploits the very foundation of a TCP protocol. Any stateful TCP connection between a client and a server begins with a three-way TCP handshake. And essentially the client sends an initial connection request packet with the synchronized flag turned on, and then the server responds back with a SYN ACK packet, and finally the client responds back with the acknowledgement packet. Well, now at this point is when a connection is established and data is not exchanged until that connection is established. But this stateful process can be very easily abused by attackers to cause denial of service events, where you're sending a bunch of SYN packets towards the victim server, and the server it occupies the router's memory, and it's beyond the point, it's unable to allocate any further memory for any legitimate clients, causing the router to either crash or prevent it from serving legitimate connections. It's very fundamental to communication, to TCP communication, as I just mentioned, and that's why it remains a very popular method of a DDoS attack. When we look at the top countries that were attacked by network layer attacks, the way we analyze them is that we bucket the traffic by the Cloudflare edge data center locations where the traffic was ingested, and not by the source IP. So we were bucketing traffic by source IP for application layer DDoS attacks. And the reason, but not for network layer DDoS attacks, the reason is that when attackers launch these network layer DDoS attacks, they can very easily spoof the source IP in order to obfuscate the attack source and introduce randomness into the attack properties, which can make it very hard for simple DDoS protection systems to block the attack. Hence, we were able to derive the source country based on if we were to derive the source country based on a spoofed source IP address, we would get a spoofed country. And we're able to overcome this challenge because of the location of Cloudflare data centers in which the attack was observed. And we're able to achieve geographical accuracy in our report because we have data centers in over 250 cities across the world. And when we looked at traffic for the last quarter, we noticed that attacks originating from Moldova quadrupled, making it the country with the highest percentage of network layer DDoS attack activity. And this was followed by Moldova, and this is followed by Philippines, Brunei, Colombia, Korea, and Vietnam. All right, so we talked about ransom DDoS attacks over voice over IP companies. We talked about the Meris botnet. We talked about application layer DDoS attacks, the geographical distribution, the sophistication in terms of attack vectors, and also the frequency of attacks. And we did that for network layer attacks as well. Now, I want to very quickly go over Cloudflare's DDoS protection solution and what we have in place. Essentially, our network layer DDoS protection solution, it's called Magic Transit. The big orange cloud you see in the middle is a representation of Cloudflare's global network. The way our solution works is we use BGP rerouting to attract traffic, to announce your routes on the internet and attract traffic destined for your network. We ingest that traffic using BGP, as I mentioned, and then filter it using our algorithms for any threats, and then send that clean traffic over secure connections, be it IPsec or be it a direct connection from our network to your network. Over any GRE tunnels or IPsec or a direct connection. So that's how essentially we work. What's differentiated about Cloudflare is that we process everything at the same data center. So unlike a lot of legacy providers, we believe, when I talk about legacy providers, I'm talking about scrubbing centers, which often divert traffic to dedicated data centers for a lot of processing. And the reason for this is that the majority of these scrubbing centers providers originated as companies that sell DDoS mitigation hardware appliances. Their customers would purchase the appliance and install them in the data centers, but purchasing, managing, and maintaining those appliances are complex. It's expensive, and you can't really provision new data centers without buying hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of these boxes. And also, as the size of DDoS attacks grew, these organizations started migrating to the cloud, and these appliance vendors had to adapt as well. But what happened was they couldn't build a bunch of data centers overnight, so they built these very few and limited number of data centers for scrubbing, for DDoS scrubbing, which were dedicated towards DDoS mitigation. But then they had limited interconnectivity. They only offer DDoS mitigation, and building a scalable cloud service that would be able to support all of its customers' traffic and other multiple services was just not feasible for these companies. But the result that customers have is that they have to endure a lot of latency for any additional processing that needs to be done on their traffic. So any web application firewall inspection, any CDN caching that needs to be done needs to be diverted to a different data center. And none of that happens with Cloudflare. We run every single service across anything that you know for. We were conceived in the cloud. Every server in every Cloudflare data center runs the same software, which includes all of Cloudflare services. So whether you know us for caching or web application firewall or network firewalling or DDoS protection, whatever it is, we run that on every server in every single data center across all of our physical presence in 250 cities across 100+ countries. We're also recognized by analysts for our DDoS mitigation by IDC, Gartner, and Forrester. We were named a leader as recently as 2021 in one of the Forrester reports. If you want access to these analyst reports, I'm more than happy to send them your way. Just shoot me an email at vivek@cloudflare.com. And then finally, I want to end with a story about Wikipedia. It's, of course, everyone knows Wikipedia. It's one of the most visited websites in the world. They experienced a massive DDoS attack in early September of 2019. And we reached out to them to find out how we can help. And within a few hours after they responded, we were able to onboard them. And even though they were previously struggling to recover from some of the persistent DDoS attacks that were targeting their servers, which had knocked them offline, we were able to onboard them immediately, and not just onboard them to bring their services back online, but also make sure that they did not have any added latency. In fact, once they onboarded with us, they even expanded their entire deployment with Cloudflare after they were impressed by how minimal latency was imposed, and in some cases, they also noticed that traffic over the Cloudflare network was in fact faster than they noticed over the public internet. All right, that is the end of my presentation. I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I will now get to the Q&A, but if I'm not able to get to your question today, please send me an email at vivek@cloudflare.com, and I'll be more than happy to answer that for you. But in the interim, I see that there's a lot of questions that are coming in. The first one is, why do SYN floods remain so popular? Yeah, it's true. SYN floods are continuously top the charts as the most popular DDoS attack vector again and again. It's, as I mentioned, it's very common today because the ease with which we can command IoT devices to initiate connections to a server, really. If an attack is created using a botnet, the likelihood of tracking the attack back to its source is very low. SYN floods have been around for years. I doubt it's going away anytime soon. It's also because it's very fundamental to TCP communication between a client and a server on the internet. So not only is it easy to generate, but also it's difficult. It's fundamental to communication between a client and the server. So that's why it's just super popular. The next question is, how do you expect the current time or duration of DDoS attacks to change as we move to more complex services? Well, it depends on complex services, but as we're seeing more and more services move to the cloud, the industry trend is that attacks are getting shorter and smaller in general. Now, that doesn't mean they don't do any harm. Launching a DDoS attack has become very cheap, especially in the pandemic. We're seeing more and more people, including amateurs and teenagers, sitting at home with nothing much to do and they're just bored, and they can buy these DDoS as a service tools for a few dollars on the internet and launch DDoS attacks. But we can only launch these DDoS attacks in a cost-effective manner with limited bandwidth. So we think that's one of the reasons why we see these attacks be smaller and shorter in duration. We also do think that attackers are using them as smoke screens to actually not be to actually divert the attention of security engineers towards something else that might be happening. Alternatively, they might also be used to probe cyber defenses of a target. They're trying to understand what your DDoS mitigation is currently deployed to protect you against. And we know that not all DDoS mitigation providers are the same. So, and in other cases, we've also noticed that, and I mentioned this too, attackers are generating small DDoS attacks as proof and warning to the target organizations of their ability to cause real damage later on. We've seen that with ransom DDoS attacks, where they're typically followed by ransom email to the target organization, often demanding payment as well. Next question is, what are some other things that Cloudflare does to protect customers from DDoS attacks other than Magic Transit? Okay, so Magic Transit is our network layer DDoS protection service. We also do, of course, DDoS protection for websites or web applications, and then any TCP or UDP applications as well that might be custom. So a lot of our gambling customers use our product called Spectrum. We have 3 DDoS protection products at Cloudflare. If you want to learn more about it, send me a note or send a note to sales@cloudflare.com, and we're happy to walk you through them. Was there increases in the attacks against RDP endpoints across networks with more and more businesses transitioning to work from home solutions? Absolutely. We see that all the time, not just RDP endpoints, but also VPN servers, because these are single points of failure for entire networks. And when a lot of us had to immediately transition to working from home in March of 2020, not only were these servers significantly overloaded, but also they became very, very vulnerable to DDoS attacks. So we're constantly talking to customers on not just how to protect their servers, but also how to ensure that their performance is very fast. The next question I see is, I'm sorry, I mentioned that. can you go into a little more detail how the BGP announcement part works for Magic Transit? Absolutely. So the way this works is essentially a customer comes to us and then we want to onboard them. And just because of the nature of how this product is or how the technology works, we need a letter of authorization from the customer before we're able to onboard you and start announcing your routes on the internet. While previously you had your own ASN, your autonomous system number of your network that you would advertise to the world to attract or ingest all the traffic that's destined to you, we essentially take that over from you, and we then start advertising routes using BGP. Once we get that letter of authorization from you for the subnets that you onboard, and then all your traffic then automatically gets rerouted towards Cloudflare's data centers, and that's where we do all the inspection and all the filtering, and before we send all that clean traffic back to you over secure tunnels. Could you share these slides? Yes, absolutely. We'll share these slides with everyone. The next question is, what are some key considerations when picking a cloud-based DDoS vendor? Now, that is a very good question as well. I'm assuming you mean more than for DDoS protection, because if it was for DDoS protection, of course, the answer here is very straightforward. But actually, even for more than DDoS protection, one thing to keep in mind is that CISOs or even CTOs are not really just thinking about DDoS, right? There's a lot of other things on your mind. And there's web application firewall, there's network firewalling, you might need CDN, you might need application, you might even need something for traffic acceleration and things like that. But what you want to keep in mind is, before picking a vendor, pick a vendor that has a comprehensive suite of services. And that's for 3 reasons. One is troubleshooting. Like previously in the world of on-premises hardware, you could just unplug a box on your rack and see if it was that box that was causing issues. You can't really do that with cloud providers. You can't use cloud provider A for CDN, cloud provider B for DDoS, and cloud provider C for web application firewall. And then just say, troubleshooting is one major issue. The second, when you're using different cloud providers for different services, is your packet has to hop between one cloud provider to the other, and each hop is now milliseconds. It's not microseconds like it used to be in the on-premises world. So you want to pick a vendor for even performance reasons, a vendor that can provide you a suite of services. And the third is cost. A vendor that's providing you a lot of these services bundled together is more likely to give you a bigger cost benefit than going a la carte. So my advice would be, consider a vendor who has a large menu of networking and security services, and make sure that they of course meet your specific custom requirements. At Cloudflare, we do have not just DDoS, but we have zero trust solutions. We have serverless compute. Of course, we provide CDN and web application firewall. We also have a network firewall called Magic Firewall. So we are building this entire suite of networking and security and performance solutions so that our customers can benefit not just from a troubleshooting and performance perspective, but also from a cost perspective. And I think that is the end of all the questions I see. If there's any other questions, please do send them my way. But at this point, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And once again, it was great doing this webinar. If you have any questions, send them my way at vivek@cloudflare.com or shoot me a note on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with you there as well. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and thank you very much.